Axel Rose, the snarling, furious voice that defined an era. The man who turned teenage anger into an anthem that millions learned to shout back. For decades, he was a living, breathing symbol of rock excess and raw, unpredictable talent. A frontman who could charm crowds and explode at a moment's notice. But time changes everyone. Fans who remember the leather jacket, the baseball cap, and the impossible vocal range have been asking the same question lately. How is Axel Rose living now? In recent years, he hasn't vanished. He has been on tour. He's still making headlines, and he's faced health scares and controversies that would have overwhelmed a lesser soul. Yet beneath the tabloid flashes and viral clips is a quieter, more complicated story. A man who's still singing his heart out while learning how to navigate aging, old wounds, and a life built in extremes. This isn't just the entertainment beat's latest clickbait. It's a human story about endurance, reinvention, and the cost of decades spent at the center of a perfect storm called Guns N' Roses. In this video, we'll follow Axel from the golden chaos of appetite for destruction to the fraught present. The tours that keep him in arenas, the medical scares that worried fans, the legal and personal battles that shadowed him, and the surprising ways he's trying, imperfectly, stubbornly, to carry on. This is the real messy life behind the legend Axel Rose. The name alone once sent shockwaves through the music world. The fiery frontman of Guns N' Roses wasn't just a rock star. He was a storm in human form. With that unmistakable voice, raw stage energy, and wild unpredictability, Axel didn't just sing. He exploded. From the roaring anthems of Welcome to the Jungle and Sweet Child O' Mine to the haunting cries of November Rain, he defined an era, a time when rock music was dangerous, untamed, and alive. But the man who once ruled stadiums filled with thunderous applause now lives a life far from the chaos he once embodied. Today, Axel Rose is almost unrecognizable, not just in appearance, but in spirit. Behind the sunglasses and the silence is a man who has finally found peace in the very stillness he once ran from. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Axel's fame came at a heavy cost. The world saw his glory but not his wounds. Behind every sold-out concert were endless battles, with bandmates, the press, and most of all himself. His perfectionism and volatile temper often made him the villain in stories told about Guns N' Roses. But the truth was more tragic. Axel was a deeply sensitive soul, one scarred by a difficult childhood and haunted by trauma that no fame could heal. His success only magnified his pain. By the mid-1990s, the band that had defined rock music began to fracture. Slash, Duff, and other original members drifted away, leaving Axel alone with the burden of a legacy too heavy for one man to carry. For years, he vanished from public life. No concerts, no interviews, only silence. Fans wondered if he'd ever return. Some called him a recluse. Others said he'd lost himself completely. But those who knew him best said he was simply trying to heal. When Axel finally returned to the stage years later, he was older, heavier, and noticeably calmer. Gone was the furious young man who once battled the world from behind the microphone. In his place stood someone reflective, grounded, even grateful. During his reunion with Guns N' Roses in 2016, fans were stunned not only by how strong his voice still was, but by how gentle his presence had become. He smiled more. He spoke softly. He thanked the crowd. Today, Axel lives quietly. He's no longer chasing fame or trying to prove anything. He rarely gives interviews, preferring to spend time at home in Malibu, surrounded by art, books, and his beloved pets. Friends describe him as private, thoughtful, even spiritual. He's traded the chaos of rock and roll for calm evenings, walks along the coast, and moments of reflection that once seemed impossible for him. Yet, despite his silence, Axel's legacy continues to roar louder than ever. Guns N' Roses remains one of the best-selling rock bands of all time. New generations continue to discover their music, and the band's tours, when they happen, still sell out within minutes. For many fans, seeing Axel perform again feels like watching a piece of history that somehow survived the storm. There's something heartbreakingly beautiful about Axel's story. He lived the dream that millions crave, only to realize that peace was the one thing success couldn't buy. The wild, angry young man who once screamed into microphones has found solace not in the crowd's cheers, but in quiet moments of gratitude. When fans occasionally spot him now, they say he looks content. A little older, yes, but softer, calmer. He smiles more easily. His eyes no longer burn with fury, but with wisdom. The man who once roared, "You're gonna die," now speaks with a quiet tone of survival. Axel Rose's life is a reminder that even the loudest hearts eventually crave silence. He may have stepped away from the madness, but the fire that once defined him still flickers. Not on stage, but within. And for those who grew up screaming his lyrics into the night, seeing Axel like this doesn't feel sad. It feels right. Because after decades of chaos, heartbreak, and redemption, he's finally found something rarer than fame or fortune: peace. Before Axel Rose became one of the most talked-about rock icons on Earth, he was simply William Bruce Rose Jr., a boy from Lafayette, Indiana, carrying scars that would later shape both his genius and his pain. His childhood was a storm, one filled with confusion, anger, and betrayal. Raised in a deeply religious and turbulent home, young Axel endured experiences no child should face. Music became his only escape, his only voice in a world that never truly listened. When he arrived in Los Angeles in the early 1980s, Axel was restless, hungry, and broke, but he carried a fire that refused to die. He met fellow dreamers like Slash, Duff McKagan, Izzy Stradlin, and Steven Adler, and together they built Guns N' Roses, a band that would soon redefine rock music forever. They were reckless, raw, and unapologetic. Los Angeles had never seen anything like them. Their debut album, Appetite for Destruction, exploded in 1987, changing everything. The world went from ignoring Axel to worshiping him. His voice, powerful, piercing, and emotional, became the anthem of an entire generation. Every lyric he wrote came from truth and pain, and that's what made people feel it so deeply. But as the fame grew, so did the chaos. Axel's perfectionism was legendary and terrifying. Rehearsals would stretch for hours. Shows started late. Arguments with bandmates became routine. Yet when the lights went on and that first note hit, the magic was undeniable. No one could command a stage like Axel Rose. He wasn't just performing. He was bleeding on stage every night. But behind the wild performances and chart-topping hits, Axel was falling apart. Fame had opened every door, yet none led to peace. The headlines painted him as unpredictable, volatile, the rock star who fought with everyone, including his own band. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Axel was a man trying to control the chaos inside him by controlling everything around him. By the early 1990s, the cracks began to show. The Use Your Illusion tour was one of the most ambitious in history, and one of the most exhausting. Night after night, millions screamed his name, but Axel's smile was fading. His relationships crumbled, friendships turned cold, and the man who once ruled the world began to retreat from it. When Guns N' Roses began to fall apart, it wasn't just a breakup, it was a heartbreak. Axel watched as Slash and Duff, his brothers in music, walked away. The band that had once been his home became his battlefield. For a while, Axel tried to rebuild it, bringing in new members, recording obsessively, chasing a sound only he could hear. But the world had changed, and Axel's perfectionism became his prison. Fans waited more than a decade for Chinese Democracy, the album that became rock's most famous ghost. When it finally released in 2008, it was met with mixed reviews. Some called it brilliant. Others called it overworked. But for Axel, it wasn't about fame anymore. It was closure. It was the sound of a man who had been through fire and still stood. After that, Axel disappeared again. No tours, no interviews, just silence. For many, it was heartbreaking. The man who once defined rebellion now seemed to have surrendered to solitude. But perhaps for the first time, he wasn't running away. He was finally resting. He had seen everything: love, hate, fortune, loss, And somewhere in the quiet, he began to find himself again. Because even legends get tired of being legends. Axel Rose was a ghost in the world he once ruled. The voice that had set arenas ablaze was silent, and fans were left wondering if they would ever hear him again. The man who once commanded the biggest crowds on Earth had chosen to vanish, leaving behind whispers, myths, and memories. In 2016, that moment finally came. When the world learned that Axel Rose, Slash, and Duff McKagan were reuniting for the Not in This Lifetime tour, few believed it at first. The wounds between them had run deep. Decades of anger, lawsuits, and silence had built an emotional wall few thought could be broken. But Axel, now older and far more reflective, made the call himself. "Let's do it," he said quietly, not as the furious young star he once was, but as a man ready to heal old scars. When he walked onto the stage for the first reunion show, the crowd erupted in tears, screams, and disbelief. It wasn't just a concert. It was resurrection. The lights dimmed, the first chords of It's So Easy blasted through the speakers. And there he was, Axel Rose, smiling. Not the snarl, not the fury, but a genuine, human smile. The years had softened him. The rage that once burned behind his blue eyes had been replaced with gratitude. He moved differently, spoke differently. The voice, still powerful, still uniquely his, carried a new kind of emotion. It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was redemption. Touring again with Slash and Duff wasn't just about music. It was about closure. Axel had finally realized that the people he once fought against were the very ones who understood him best. The energy between them on stage was electric, a mixture of nostalgia, forgiveness, and unspoken brotherhood. Each performance felt like an apology set to music. The Not in This Lifetime tour became one of the highest-grossing tours in history. Night after night, Axel showed up, punctual, kind, and focused. Fans who had followed him since the chaos of the late 80s couldn't believe how much he had changed. Gone was the unpredictability. Gone was the hostility. In its place was a man who simply wanted to give people what they'd been waiting for, music that still mattered. Off stage, Axel's transformation ran even deeper. He had grown to appreciate the quiet. The man who once trashed dressing rooms now spent time reading philosophy, meditating, and caring for animals. He spoke often about empathy, about understanding people instead of fighting them. The wild rock star who once lived for adrenaline now found peace in simplicity, long walks, laughter with old friends, moments away from the flash of cameras. Those close to him said that Axel's maturity came not from fame, but from loneliness. Years of isolation had forced him to face himself, to sit in silence with the pain he had always tried to drown out with noise. In that stillness, he rediscovered something he'd lost: gratitude. When asked in a rare interview how it felt to perform again, Axel smiled and said, "It feels right, like I came home." And in many ways he had. The crowds still roared, the lights still blazed, but now the applause no longer fed his ego. It fed his soul. He knew he couldn't rewrite his past, but he could choose how the story ended. And that's exactly what he did. The reunion wasn't just a comeback. It was redemption. Axel Rose wasn't chasing his old image anymore. He had outgrown it. By the end of the tour, fans weren't just cheering for the music. They were cheering for the man himself. Because they could see it now. Behind the tattoos, the leather, and the legend, there was a survivor. Someone who had been to hell and back and somehow found peace waiting for him on the other side. And that, more than any record or concert, became Axel Rose's greatest achievement. Not being the loudest man in rock, but becoming the quietest soul to ever find his way home. Today, Axel Rose lives a life so far removed from the chaos that once defined him, it almost feels like a different lifetime. The wild-haired frontman who once ruled the stage in ripped jeans and rebellion now spends most of his days in quiet solitude. A man who has traded roaring crowds for peace, fame for privacy, and adrenaline for reflection. He still lives in his longtime home in Malibu, tucked behind tall gates and surrounded by trees, where ocean breezes carry the echoes of a past he's finally made peace with. Neighbors rarely see him, but those who do describe him as polite, grounded, and content. The man who once sprinted across stages to the sound of tens of thousands now enjoys early mornings, tending to his pets, listening to classic records, and writing music, and not for charts but for himself. It's a simple life, one built on lessons that took decades to learn. Axel no longer chases perfection. He's learned that peace doesn't come from applause, but from acceptance. The same man who once demanded total control over every note, every show, now lives by one quiet truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let go. In rare moments, he still takes the stage with Guns N' Roses. His voice, though aged by time, still carries that unmistakable grit and soul. When he sings November Rain now, it feels different, softer, wiser. Fans often say you can feel his life in his voice, every joy and heartbreak woven through the notes. The passion never left. It simply matured. Behind the scenes, Axel has become a mentor of sorts, quietly advising younger artists who reach out to him. He doesn't seek credit or publicity, but he offers honest advice. Don't lose yourself trying to be what they want. Be who you are, even if it costs you. Those who meet him describe him as surprisingly humble, someone who's seen every extreme and now chooses balance above all else. He's also become a quiet advocate for causes close to his heart. From environmental awareness to animal welfare, Axel has used his influence to support without seeking attention. He donates privately, often anonymously, because for him, kindness means more when it's unseen. In the stillness of his life, Axel often reflects on the cost of fame, the friendships lost, the years spent fighting ghosts that didn't deserve the war. But he doesn't dwell on regret. Instead, he looks at his journey with gratitude. He once said in a rare interview, "You can't stay angry forever. One day you wake up and realize that peace feels better than being right." To fans, he'll always be the fire behind Welcome to the Jungle, the voice of Sweet Child of Mine, the soul of November Rain. But to those who truly look deeper, he's something more. A survivor. A man who walked through fame, fury, heartbreak, and isolation, and still came out standing. Now in his 60s, Axel understands what few ever do, that real success isn't found in the spotlight, but in silence, when you can finally sit with yourself and feel at peace. The world once knew him as a legend, a rebel, a rock god. But today, Axel Rose is simply a man, wiser, gentler, and more human than ever. Sometimes he's spotted attending concerts quietly, blending into the crowd, smiling as young musicians take the stage. He doesn't need the microphone anymore. He's already said everything he needed to say through his songs, and maybe that's the beauty of it all. The man who once shouted to the world has finally learned to listen. The rebel who once ran from everything has finally stopped running. Axel Rose's life today isn't a tragedy, it's a triumph. A story of redemption, resilience, and peace. Because even after all the chaos, all the fame, and all the noise, he found the one thing that truly mattered.